What happens when power meets prejudice on a quiet afternoon, and everything a man believes about control shatters in the span of a heartbeat? The shopping district gleamed under the California sun, all polished glass and designer storefronts reflecting the kind of wealth that whispers rather than shouts. Marcus Chen adjusted his sunglasses as his driver pulled the Maybach to the curb, 3 blocks from where his daughter said she'd be. She'd wanted to browse alone, like any other 17-year-old craving independence. He'd agreed, but only if she stayed within the safe grid of boutiques they both knew well. Sarah was responsible. Sarah was smart. And in Marcus's world of calculated risks and billion-dollar decisions, he'd learned to trust patterns. His daughter had never given him reason to worry, until his phone rang with her number, and all he heard was her voice, tight, afraid, trying so hard to stay calm, saying, "Dad, there's a problem." 3 blocks became an eternity. Officer Derek Hutchins had been having a bad day, the kind that starts with burnt coffee and an argument with a supervisor and festers into something uglier with each passing hour. 23 years on the force had taught him to read situations quickly, to trust his gut, to know trouble when he saw it. And when he'd spotted the young black girl leaving the jewelry store with a distinctive turquoise shopping bag, something in his gut had whispered thief. Maybe it was the way she'd glanced around. Maybe it was the oversized hoodie despite the warm weather. Maybe it was something else entirely, something he'd never admit even to himself in the dark quiet of 3 a.m. when a man's conscience speaks loudest. He'd followed her half a block before making his move. "Excuse me, miss, I need you to stop right there." Sarah Chen had frozen, the turquoise bag suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She turned slowly, taking in the uniform, the hand resting casually on the belt, the expression that somehow managed to be both bored and aggressive. She'd been taught how to handle moments like this. Her father had made sure of it, though she'd always half believed, half hoped she'd never need the lessons. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "That bag, what's in it?" "A bracelet. I just purchased it from... I'm going to need to see a receipt." Sarah had reached for her phone, intending to pull up the email confirmation, but Hutchins's hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it, just touching it. A gesture that said everything and nothing. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The sidewalk around them had begun to clear, pedestrians sensing the shift in atmosphere the way animals sense a coming storm. A few stopped at a distance, phones out, recording. Sarah's hands trembled as she raised them slightly, still clutching her phone and the shopping bag. "The receipt is on my phone. I can show you. And the store is right there. We can go back and they'll confirm. What I need you to do is calm down and follow instructions." Hutchins stepped closer, and Sarah caught the smell of old coffee and something sour. "You seem nervous. Why are you nervous?" "I'm not nervous, I'm confused. I bought a bracelet. I have a receipt. I don't understand what I've done wrong." "Shoplifting is a serious offense." "I didn't shoplift anything." The words came out louder than she'd intended, frustration finally cracking through the careful calm. Hutchins's expression hardened. He'd been accused of profiling before. It was practically a hobby for certain types, and he'd learned to recognize that tone. That entitled indignation that came from kids who thought they were special, thought the rules didn't apply to them. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What? No, I didn't do anything." "You're resisting." "I'm not resisting, I'm trying to explain." His hand closed around her arm, and Sarah's phone clattered to the sidewalk. The shopping bag fell beside it. She tried to pull away on instinct, and that instinct became evidence of resistance, which became justification for force. In 3 seconds, Sarah Chen went from confused teenager to suspect on the ground, asphalt scraping her cheek, her wrists being wrenched behind her back, while a knee pressed between her shoulder blades. The people recording kept recording. No one intervened. That was the thing about these moments. They happened in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, and still they happened. Sarah managed to gasp out one word. Dad. She'd already called him. The line had stayed open, dropped into her hoodie pocket, and Marcus Chen, 3 blocks away, heard everything. The crowd parted without knowing why. Some unconscious recognition of force moving toward them. Marcus moved like a man who'd forgotten how to feel fear, or perhaps remembered too well what it cost. His security detail flanked him at a careful distance, close enough to respond, far enough to let him lead. His lawyer was already on the phone with the chief of police. His assistant was pulling footage from every camera in a 3-block radius, but Marcus himself was focused on only one thing. The scene ahead, where a uniformed officer knelt on his daughter's back while she struggled to breathe. Get your hands off her. Now. The voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade, quiet but absolute. Hutchins looked up, annoyed at the interruption, ready to tell another bystander to back off and mind their business. But something in the man's face, the way he moved, the sudden subtle shift in the crowd's energy, made him hesitate. Sir, this is police business. Step back. Marcus didn't step back. He stepped forward. That's my daughter. You have 3 seconds to remove your hands from her, or what happens next will define the rest of your life. There was no threat in the tone. Threats require uncertainty. This was simply information being delivered, the way one might inform someone their house was on fire. Hutchins felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. The man's suit probably cost more than Hutchins made in a month. The watch on his wrist could have paid off his mortgage. And his eyes held the kind of certainty that came from never in an entire life being told no. Sir, I said step back, or Officer Hutchins. The name came from Marcus's lawyer, now beside him, phone extended. Chief Reeves would like a word. And in the pause that followed, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Officer Derek Hutchins felt the ground shift beneath him like the first tremor before an earthquake, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that his bad day had just become something far worse. The phone passed from the lawyer's hand to Hutchins's ear, felt like it weighed 100 pounds. On the other end, Chief Reeves's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man watching his pension evaporate in real time. The conversation lasted 30 seconds. Hutchins' face went through a spectrum of colors, red to white, to something grayish that spoke of a man watching his future rewrite itself. When he handed the phone back, his hand shook slightly. He stood, slowly, removing his knee from Sarah's back with the careful deliberation of someone defusing a bomb they'd accidentally armed. Sarah scrambled to her feet, gasping, her father's arms already around her before she'd fully risen. Marcus held her the way he'd held her as a child after nightmares, one hand cradling her head, the other wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He was murmuring something into her hair, words meant only for her, while his eyes stayed locked on Hutchins with an intensity that could melt steel. The crowd had swelled. Phones everywhere now, dozens of them capturing every angle. In the age of viral justice, this moment was already being uploaded, shared, spreading across networks with the velocity of wildfire. The narrative was being written in real time. Black teenager, white cop, wealthy father, the intersection of race and power playing out on a sun-drenched California sidewalk. But beneath the optics, beneath what would become hashtags and think pieces, there was something more human happening. A father protecting his child, a man confronting the limits of his authority, and a girl trying to understand why buying a bracelet had led to asphalt against her face. Are you hurt? Marcus's voice was steady, but Sarah could feel the tremor in his hands. She shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. The lawyer, Daniel Marsh, a man whose retainer cost more than most people's annual salary, was already documenting everything. Photos of Sarah's scraped cheek, her torn hoodie, the red marks on her wrists. Evidence, should it be needed. And it would be needed. Marcus Chen hadn't built an empire by hoping for the best. Hutchins stood awkwardly, caught in that strange purgatory between action and consequence. His training said one thing, the phone call from his chief said another, and the growing crowd, the cameras, the sudden appearance of what looked like a very expensive legal team, all said he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. He tried to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage. There was a report of shoplifting in the area. I was investigating. What report? Daniel's question came sharp and immediate. From whom? When? We'll need the call logs, the dispatch records, everything. Hutchins faltered. There hadn't been a report. There'd been instinct or prejudice wearing instinct's clothes, and the comfortable certainty that he could trust what his gut told him. That certainty felt less comfortable now, exposed to sunlight and scrutiny. I observed suspicious behavior. Define suspicious. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying across the space between them with quiet force. My daughter left a store with a shopping bag. What about that was suspicious? Walk me through your thinking. Help me understand what you saw that justified putting your hands on a 17-year-old girl. The question hung in the air, deceptively simple. But everyone listening understood what was really being asked. Was it the hoodie? The shopping bag? Or was it the brown skin, the textured hair, the unconscious equation between blackness and criminality that lived in the spaces people didn't like to examine? Hutchins opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Whatever answer he gave would be wrong. Silence stretched out, broken only by the click of cameras and the murmur of the crowd. Sarah watched the officer struggle and felt something unexpected stir beneath her anger and fear, something almost like pity. He looked smaller now, diminished, like a man who'd grabbed what he thought was a rope in the dark and found he'd seized a live wire instead. But the pity didn't last. Her wrists still ached. Her cheek still stung. And the memory of that knee between her shoulders, the weight of it pressing down, the concrete scraping her face that would stay with her long after the bruises faded. That was the thing people didn't understand about moments like this. They didn't end when the physical threat passed. They burrowed deep, changing the architecture of how you moved through the world. A news van pulled up, then another. Someone had called the media, or maybe they monitored police scanners, always hunting for the next story. Reporters spilled out with that particular hunger that came from sensing something big, something that would lead the evening broadcast. A black girl, a white cop. And now the cameras would pick apart every detail, every angle, every possible interpretation. The story would be told and retold, shaped and reshaped, until the truth of what happened became almost secondary to what it represented. Marcus saw the news crews and made a decision. He turned to Sarah, both hands on her shoulders, making sure she was looking at him. Do you want to leave, or do you want to stay and tell your story? It was a gift, that choice. He could have swept her away, handled everything through lawyers and PR teams, protected her from the scrutiny that was about to descend. But he was offering her agency in a situation where agency had been stripped away. Sarah thought about it, really thought, feeling the weight of the question. Part of her wanted nothing more than to disappear into the back of her father's car, to go home and shower and try to scrub away the feeling of helplessness. But another part, the part that had listened to her father's stories about building something from nothing, about standing up even when it cost you, that part knew running would leave something unfinished. I want to stay. Marcus nodded once, pride and concern warring in his expression. He squeezed her shoulders gently, then stepped back to let her move forward. Daniel moved with her, a subtle presence at her elbow, ready to intervene if needed. The reporters converged like sharks, scenting blood, microphones extended, questions overlapping into chaos. Sarah took a breath, remembered her father's lessons about board meetings and investors, about staying calm when everyone else was losing their heads, and began to speak. She told it simply. The bracelet purchase, the walk along the sidewalk, the officer's approach. She didn't embellish, didn't perform, just stated facts in a voice that shook slightly but never broke. The cameras caught everything. The scrape on her cheek, the tremor in her hands, the way she had to pause sometimes to collect herself. Raw and real and devastating in its ordinariness. This was the story that played out in variations across the country, usually without the wealthy father, without the cameras, without the chief of police making concerned phone calls. This was what happened in the gaps between headlines, in the moments that never made the news because there was no one powerful enough to force the world to pay attention. Hutchins watched from beside his patrol car, and something in him cracked. Maybe it was seeing his actions reflected back through the eyes of this girl who was somebody's daughter, somebody's whole world. Maybe it was the growing awareness that his 23 years of service, his commendations, his clean record, all of it could be undone by this single moment of judgment. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first genuine flicker of understanding that he'd been wrong. Not wrong in tactics or procedure, but wrong in the assumption that had started the entire cascade. Wrong in seeing threat where there was only innocence. Wrong in ways that were harder to fix than paperwork and apologies. He wanted to say something, to explain or apologize or justify, but his mouth felt full of cotton, and his thoughts moved like sludge. The distance between where he stood and where Sarah spoke to the cameras felt like miles, like they existed in different countries with no shared language. How did you bridge a gap like that? How did you take back hands on skin, knee on back, the casual deployment of force against someone whose only crime was existing in a body that triggered assumptions? Marcus watched his daughter on the news crew's monitors, saw her chin lift as she found her strength, and felt something fierce and painful swell in his chest. Pride, yes, but also rage. Rage that she had to do this, had to stand here and justify her existence, had to be articulate and sympathetic and controlled, while a grown man who'd assaulted her got to hide behind a badge and qualified immunity. The money he'd made, the power he'd built, the empire he'd constructed brick by brick. What good was any of it if it couldn't protect his daughter from this? What was the point of being a billionaire if your child could still be thrown to the ground on a sidewalk for the crime of shopping while black? But even as the rage burned, he knew the answer. The money had saved her. Not from the initial encounter, that had already happened, that damage was done, but from everything that came after. Without his wealth, without his connections, without the ability to have the chief of police on speed dial, this would have ended differently. Sarah would have been arrested. There would have been charges, a record, a black mark that followed her through college applications and job interviews. Or worse. The thought of worse made Marcus's hands clench into fists. He'd heard the stories, seen the news reports, knew the statistics about how these encounters could escalate into tragedy. The press conference, because that's what it had become, wrapped up as the jewelry store manager emerged, breathless and apologetic, clutching receipts and security footage proving what everyone should have already known. Sarah Chen had bought a bracelet, paid in full, and left the store as a paying customer. The evidence was almost anticlimactic, arriving after the damage was done, like an umbrella delivered after you've already been soaked by rain. As the crowd began to disperse and the reporters packed up their equipment, already rushing to file stories that would dominate the evening news cycle, Marcus took his daughter's hand and finally led her toward the car. But before they could reach it, Hutchins called out, his voice rough and uncertain. "Miss Chen, They turned. The officer stood alone now, his backup having conveniently vanished, looking older than he had an hour ago. Whatever he'd been about to say died in his throat under Marcus's steady gaze. Some apologies were too small for the wounds they tried to heal. Some words couldn't bridge the distance they'd need to travel. Sarah looked at him, this man who'd terrified her, who'd used his power to harm her and saw not a monster but something sadder. A man who'd been so certain he was right that he'd never questioned his own vision. She didn't accept his unspoken apology, but she didn't spit venom either. She just nodded once, acknowledging his presence, then turned away. Sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. Sometimes you didn't owe your victimizer closure. The Maybach's door closed with the solid thunk of German engineering, sealing Sarah into leather and quiet. As they pulled away from the curb, she caught a final glimpse of Hutchins in the side mirror, standing alone on the sidewalk, and wondered if this moment would change him or just make him more careful about choosing his targets. The car moved through traffic with the smooth inevitability of money, but inside, the silence felt like something alive and breathing. Sarah stared out the window, watching the city blur past, storefronts and pedestrians and the ordinary machinery of life continuing as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Her father sat beside her, not touching, giving her space but radiating a protective energy so intense it was almost physical. She could feel him choosing and discarding words, trying to find the right thing to say, settling finally on nothing. Sometimes silence was its own kind of wisdom. Her phone buzzed, then again, and again. A cascade of notifications that turned into a flood. The video had gone viral, as these things did, spreading across social media with exponential velocity. Millions of views already, thousands of comments. Her name, her full name, was trending. People she'd never met were dissecting her life, defending her, attacking her, turning her into a symbol for arguments that existed long before she'd ever walked into that jewelry store. She scrolled through the comments, unable to stop herself despite knowing better, watching strangers debate whether she'd deserved what happened, whether her father's wealth made this a non-story, whether she was playing the race card, or whether the officer was a victim of reverse discrimination, or whether. Don't read those. Marcus's voice was soft but firm. They don't know you. They don't know what happened. They're arguing with ghosts. Sarah locked her phone but kept holding it, a talisman against the strangeness of her new reality. Famous for being a victim. That's what she was now, at least for the next few news cycles, until something newer and more shocking came along to feed the content machine. She thought about her friends seeing the video, her teachers, the boy from AP Chemistry she'd been working up courage to talk to. They'd all have opinions now, theories about who she really was based on 60 seconds of footage stripped of context and nuance. I want to go to the office. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Marcus looked at her, searching her face for something. You sure? We can go home. Your mother's worried sick. I need to understand something. Sarah turned to face him fully. You made one phone call and everything changed. The chief of police answered immediately. That officer looked like his world was ending. How does that work exactly? How much power do you actually have? It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't simple curiosity either. It was the question of someone who'd just learned that the rules she thought governed the world were more flexible than she'd been taught, that power could bend reality in ways both terrifying and seductive. Marcus studied his daughter, seeing not the little girl who'd once believed him capable of magic, but someone approaching the age where she'd have to navigate these complexities herself. Enough, he said finally. Enough power to make a phone call that gets answered, not enough to undo what already happened to you. The Chen Global Enterprises building rose 70 stories into the San Francisco sky, glass and steel, proclaiming success in a language everyone understood. Sarah had been coming here since childhood, knew the private elevator and the executive floor, and the view from her father's office that made the city look like a toy model of itself. But today, it felt different, like she was seeing it for the first time with adult eyes. The security guards who'd always smiled at her now looked at her with something else. Pity, maybe. Or that careful gentleness people used around the recently traumatized. Word had spread fast. Of course it had. Her father employed 3,000 people, and humans loved nothing more than a story. Marcus's corner office was a study in controlled opulence, expensive but not ostentatious, powerful but not aggressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bay. Abstract art that Sarah knew cost more than most houses hung on walls the color of cream. This was the room where deals worth hundreds of millions were negotiated, where her father had built something from the raw materials of intelligence and timing, and the kind of ruthless focus that scared most people. She'd always been proud of it, proud of him. But now she wondered what it had cost, what compromises lived in the foundation of all this success. "I've been thinking about Officer Hutchins." Sarah moved to the window, putting her back to her father, finding it easier to speak to the city than to his face. "In the moment, I hated him. I was terrified. But watching him afterward, seeing his face when he realized who you were, I don't know. It felt like watching someone's life break in real time." Behind her, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried weights she'd never heard before, frequencies she wasn't sure she was supposed to detect. "That man put his hands on you, put you on the ground, made you afraid." Each sentence landed with careful emphasis. "What happens to his life now isn't your responsibility. It's not even particularly interesting to me. What's interesting is making sure nothing like that ever happens to you again. But that's the thing, isn't it?" Sarah turned back to face him. "It won't happen to me again. Not because the world changed, not because people learned something, but because you're you. Because you have money and power and the chief of police's personal number. What about all the girls who don't have that? What about the version of me from a different family, a different neighborhood? What happens to her?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slight smile touching his lips despite everything. The smile of a teacher watching a student stumble toward an important truth. "You're asking me to solve systemic racism with a checkbook. I can't. I've tried, believe me. I've funded programs, backed reforms, supported candidates who promise change, and some of it helps at the margins. But the machine is bigger than any one person's power to fix it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I can do is protect my family. Use what I've built to make sure my daughter is safe. That's not justice, Sarah. That's just privilege, and privilege doesn't fix the problem. It just makes sure you're on the winning side of it." The honesty was almost brutal. No pretense that his wealth made him a hero. No comfortable narrative where money translated into moral superiority. Just the clear-eyed acknowledgement that the game was rigged and he'd learned to play it well. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, not dramatic but fundamental, like a building settling into its foundation. "So we're complicit?" "Not a question. We're human. We protect our own. Every parent does it, whatever resources they have. I just have more resources than most." Marcus stood, joining her at the window, both of them watching the city below go about its business. "But here's what I've learned building this company. Systems change slowly, brick by brick. You can't fix everything at once. What you can do is choose where to apply pressure, where to use your leverage to create cracks in the foundation. Make enough cracks. Eventually the whole structure becomes unstable." Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't social media. It was a call from a number she didn't recognize. She declined it. Then another call, and another. The switchboard downstairs was probably lighting up like a Christmas tree. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted her trauma packaged and delivered in sound bites. "They're going to offer you things." Marcus's voice pulled her back. "Interview requests, speaking opportunities, advocacy groups wanting you to be their spokesperson. Some will be genuine. Most will be trying to use you to advance their own agendas. You'll need to decide how much of yourself you want to give to this moment." "And what do you think I should do?" "I think you should wait." He turned to look at her directly. Let the adrenaline fade. Let yourself process what happened without the cameras watching. Figure out who you are after this before you let anyone tell you who you should be. It was good advice, Sarah knew. Wise and protective and probably right. But there was something else churning in her chest, something that felt like anger transmuted into purpose. She'd spent 17 years being Marcus Chen's daughter, living in the comfortable shadow of his success, insulated from the worst of what the world could do. That insulation had been violently stripped away on a sidewalk, and now she could see things she'd been blind to before. The girl from a different neighborhood, the one without the billionaire father, that girl was still out there. Thousands of her, millions, and their stories didn't go viral. Their fathers couldn't make phone calls that changed everything. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Daniel Marsh entered, tablet in hand, moving with the efficient grace of someone who billed by the 6-minute increment. "We have developments," he said, and something in his tone made both Sarah and Marcus focus immediately. "Officer Hutchins has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department's releasing a statement expressing concern about the incident. Standard PR damage control." He swiped through screens. "But there's more. I pulled his record. This isn't his first questionable stop. 3 complaints in the last 18 months, all involving people of color, all dismissed as unsubstantiated. The information landed in the room like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't a one-time mistake, a good cop having a bad day. This was a pattern. Officer Hutchins had done this before, to other people, other families, without the resources to fight back. And the system had protected him, dismissed the complaints, let him keep his badge and his authority and his ability to hurt people with impunity. Who were they? Sarah's voice came out harder than she'd intended. The other complaints, who filed them? Daniel pulled up the files. 3 names, 3 faces, 3 stories that had gone nowhere. A 23-year-old man stopped for suspicious behavior while walking in his own neighborhood. A 16-year-old girl questioned outside a grocery store about items in her bag, all legitimately purchased. A 30-year-old woman pulled over for a traffic stop that escalated into a search of her vehicle based on what the officer claimed was the smell of marijuana. Nothing was found. All of them black or brown. All of them dismissed. All of them lacking the power to make anyone care. "I want to talk to them." Sarah spoke before she'd fully formed the thought, but once it was out, it felt inevitable. "The people who filed complaints, I want to know their stories." Marcus and Daniel exchanged a look, a whole conversation passing in that glance. This was a choice point, a moment where the path ahead branched in different directions. One way led toward quiet resolution, settlements signed with NDAs attached, the incident handled privately and professionally. The other way led toward something messier, more public, more dangerous in its implications. "Sarah, think about what you're asking." Marcus's voice carried a weight of experience. Once you start down this road, once you connect these stories together, you're not just talking about one officer's bad judgment. You're talking about a system that enables it. You're making enemies of people who protect their own. Are you ready for that fight? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Sarah thought about the knee on her back, the scrape on her cheek, the fear that had flooded her system when she realized how quickly safety could evaporate. But more than that, she thought about those 3 other faces on the screen, people who'd experienced similar moments and had nowhere to turn, no one powerful enough to make the world listen. What separated her from them wasn't innocence or guilt, wasn't behavior or choices. It was luck. The accident of birth that made her Marcus Chen's daughter instead of someone else's child. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said finally, honestly. "But I don't think I can walk away either." The decision, once made, moved with the momentum of a boulder dislodged from a cliff, gathering speed, impossible to reverse. Within 48 hours, Daniel had located all 3 complainants. Within 72, Sarah was sitting across from the first of them in a quiet corner of a cafe that smelled like espresso, and the careful dreams of people pretending their lives weren't collapsing. His name was DeMarco Johnson, and he wore the uniform of a delivery driver, his shift starting in 2 hours. He'd agreed to meet only after Daniel had assured him multiple times that this wasn't a lawsuit, wasn't a trap, wasn't anything that would make his life harder than it already was. "I don't know what you think I can tell you," DeMarco said, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched. "I filed the complaint. They said there wasn't enough evidence. End of story." Sarah had prepared questions, a whole list of them, carefully crafted to be respectful and thorough. But sitting across from this man whose eyes held the particular weariness of someone who'd stopped expecting justice, all her preparation felt hollow. Instead, she just asked him to tell her what happened. The story emerged slowly, reluctantly, like pulling splinters from old wood. DeMarco had been walking home from his cousin's house, 8 blocks through a neighborhood he'd lived in his entire life. Officer Hutchins had stopped him, asked where he was going, where he'd been, what was in his pockets. The questions had an edge, an assumption built into their phrasing. When DeMarco had asked why he was being stopped, Hutchins had cited suspicious behavior, walking with hands in pockets, looking around too much, the circular logic of suspicion that justified its own existence. The encounter had lasted 20 minutes. Nothing was found because there was nothing to find. No arrest, no charges, just time stolen and dignity eroded, and the message reinforced that his body in that space was inherently questionable. "The thing is," DeMarco said, finally drinking his coffee, "I knew better than to file that complaint. My brother told me it was pointless, that I was just going to paint a target on my back. But I was angry, you know. Thought maybe if I said something, if I documented it, maybe it would matter." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Guess I was right about the target, wrong about it mattering." "What do you mean?" "I've been stopped 4 more times since then. Different officers, but always in the same area, always with the same questions. Maybe it's coincidence, or maybe once you complain, they make sure you understand your place." He looked at Sarah directly for the first time, really seeing her. "You got your dad's money and lawyers. You got the news crews and the viral video. You think that complaint I filed is anywhere near the same thing? You think we're fighting the same fight?" The question was fair and brutal. Sarah felt the weight of her privilege like physical pressure, the invisible armor she'd worn her entire life suddenly visible and uncomfortable. DeMarco wasn't wrong. Her outrage had been amplified by wealth, her story given weight by her father's name. Without those things, she would have been just another statistic, another black girl with a story no one bothered to verify. "No," she said quietly. "We're not fighting the same fight. But maybe they should be the same fight. Maybe that's the problem." DeMarco studied her, and something in his expression shifted fractionally. Not trust, exactly, but a willingness to believe she might actually understand the difference between helping and performing help. The second complainant, Alicia Martinez, met them at a community center in the Mission District, surrounded by the sounds of children playing basketball and the smell of someone cooking rice and beans in the kitchen. She was younger than Sarah had expected, barely 20, with an infant strapped to her chest in a colorful wrap. She'd been 16 when Hutchins stopped her outside the grocery store, interrogating her about items in her bag, diapers and formula she'd bought with carefully saved babysitting money for her nephew. He'd made her empty the bag on the sidewalk, made her produce the receipt, made her stand there while he checked every item against the register tape as if she were a criminal requiring proof of innocence. "I remember thinking my mom was going to be so mad," Alicia said, rocking slightly even though the baby was asleep. "Not at me, at him, but I'd still have to hear about it, deal with it, carry it. And I was right. She filed the complaint, used words I'd never heard her use before. But nothing happened. They sent a letter saying the stop was within procedure, that the officer had reasonable suspicion. Reasonable. She repeated the word like it was foreign, tasting each syllable. What's reasonable about assuming a 16-year-old girl buying diapers must have stolen them? The third story followed the same pattern, the same casual deployment of power, the same assumption of guilt. Keisha Washington, 30 years old, a nurse who'd been pulled over on her way to a night shift. The traffic stop had stretched into 40 minutes while Hutchins searched her car, questioning her about where she was going, where she'd been, why she seemed nervous. She'd missed the start of her shift, nearly lost her job. The complaint she'd filed had included the dashcam footage from her own vehicle, showing the stop in its entirety, proving there'd been no valid reason for the extended search. It hadn't mattered. The department's investigation concluded that the officer had acted within his discretion. Sarah sat in her father's office late that night, surrounded by the transcripts of these conversations, and felt something cold and clarifying settle in her chest. This wasn't about one bad cop having one bad day. This was about a system that granted certain people the authority to question other people's existence, to demand justification for their presence in public space, to use law enforcement as a tool for maintaining hierarchies that were never spoken aloud but always understood. Officer Hutchins was a symptom. The disease ran deeper. Marcus found her there past midnight, still reading, still processing. He set down a cup of tea she hadn't asked for but needed, and waited for her to speak first. "They all knew," Sarah said finally. "Everyone who reviewed these complaints, everyone who dismissed them, everyone who let Hutchins keep his badge and his authority. They all knew he had a pattern. But knowing didn't matter, because the system protects itself. The question isn't whether Hutchins is racist. The question is whether the entire structure is designed to enable people like him." Yes. Marcus's answer was simple, unvarnished by comfort or qualification. And once you understand that, you have to decide what to do with the understanding, because you can't unknow it. You can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before. Sarah thought about her friends, the ones who'd never been stopped, never been questioned, never had to calculate the risk of walking through their own neighborhoods. She thought about the gap between their world and DeMarco's world, between the life she'd assumed was normal and the life that was actually normal for millions of people whose skin made them suspect by default. The gap felt insurmountable, a chasm so wide that building a bridge seemed like fantasy. But her father had built an empire on the foundation of impossible things made real through persistence and strategy. "I want to hold a press conference," she said. "Not just about what happened to me, about all of us, about the pattern. I want those 3 people standing with me telling their stories, making it impossible to dismiss this as an isolated incident." Daniel, who'd been lurking in the doorway with the particular stillness of lawyers sensing complications, stepped forward. "That's a nuclear option, Sarah. Once you do that, you're not just criticizing one officer. You're accusing an entire department of systemic failure. They will come after you. They'll dig into your life, those people's lives, looking for anything to discredit the narrative. And your father." He glanced at Marcus. "They'll come after him too. Business deals, contracts with the city, every interaction he's had with law enforcement or local government, all of it becomes fair game. Let them come." Marcus's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "If my daughter wants to fight this fight, we fight it. But Sarah..." He turned to her, making sure she was really hearing him. "Understand what you're volunteering for. This stops being about truth and becomes about warfare. Public opinion, media strategy, political pressure. You'll be attacked from every direction by people with resources and motivation to protect their interests. Are you sure you want this? Not as an abstract principle, but as the actual reality of your life for the next 6 months, year, however long it takes?" Sarah looked at the transcripts spread across the desk, at the faces of 3 people who'd tried to speak up and been silenced, at the machinery of power that had operated smoothly until she'd stumbled into its gears with the protection of wealth and privilege. She thought about Officer Hutchins, probably at home right now on administrative leave, betting that this would blow over the way these things always blew over. She thought about the next person he'd stop once he was back on duty, the next DeMarco or Alicia or Keisha, and whether they'd walk away with just wounded dignity or something worse. The easy thing would be to take the settlement they'd undoubtedly offer, sign the NDA, let the incident fade into the background noise of injustice that everyone acknowledged and no one fixed. The easy thing would be to use her privilege as a shield, protecting herself while leaving the system intact for everyone who lacked her advantages. But Sarah had learned something in that jewelry store, on that sidewalk, under the weight of that knee pressing into her back. She'd learned that safety was conditional, that belonging was provisional, that the world her parents had tried to build around her had walls made of money rather than genuine security. And walls, however expensive, could be breached. "Schedule the press conference," she said, and heard her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "I'll talk to DeMarco, Alicia, and Keisha, see if they're willing to stand with me. If they're not, I'll do it alone. But either way, this story needs to be told." The machinery clicked into motion with frightening efficiency. Daniel began preparing legal defenses against the counterattacks he knew were coming. Marcus made quiet phone calls to allies and contacts, shoring up support, making sure that when the inevitable pushback arrived, they'd have people in position to withstand it. And Sarah reached out to the 3 people whose complaints had been dismissed, asking them to trust her with their stories, knowing she was asking them to make themselves vulnerable in ways she was only beginning to understand. DeMarco said yes first, surprising her. When she asked why, he just shrugged and said he was tired of being afraid, that being stopped 4 times in 6 months had already marked him. So what did he have to lose by speaking truth to power that wasn't listening anyway? Alicia took longer to decide, thinking about her baby, about the life she was trying to build, about whether fighting was worth the cost of becoming visible to systems that preferred her invisible. But eventually she said yes too, for her son, so he might grow up in a world that required less courage just to exist. Keisha was the hardest. She'd already lost so much trust in institutions, in the idea that speaking up mattered, that Sarah almost gave up trying to convince her. But then Keisha asked a question that changed everything. If we do this, if we tell these stories, will anything actually change? Or is this just going to be another moment that people feel good about protesting and then forget when the next news cycle arrives? Sarah wanted to promise change, to guarantee that their courage would matter, that the system would bend under the weight of their truth. But she'd learned enough by now to know that promises like that were lies dressed up as hope. So instead, she told Keisha the only honest thing she could. "I don't know if we'll change the system, but I know if we don't try, nothing changes at all. And maybe that's the only real choice we get, between certain failure and possible success." Keisha had stared at her for a long time, weighing that answer, testing it for manipulation or naivety. Finally, she'd nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then let's try." The press conference was scheduled for Monday afternoon, 3 days away. The location would be the steps of City Hall, public and symbolic, the kind of backdrop that looked good on camera and made statements about accountability and transparency. Daniel was drafting remarks, Sarah was preparing herself mentally, and Marcus was quietly making sure that whatever happened, his daughter would be protected as much as protection was possible in the eye of an approaching storm. But on Sunday night, 36 hours before they were scheduled to face the cameras and tell their collective truth, Sarah's phone rang with a number she recognized from the worst day of her life. Officer Derek Hutchins's name glowed on her screen, and her finger hovered over the decline button, every instinct screaming at her to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the clean separation between victim and perpetrator. But something, curiosity, or the same reckless courage that had gotten her into this mess, made her answer instead. "Don't hang up," Hutchins said immediately, his voice rough, almost pleading. "Please, I need to talk to you before tomorrow, before you do whatever you're planning to do." A pause, the sound of breathing, the weight of words being assembled and discarded. "I need you to know the truth about what happened that day, the truth I haven't told anyone." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum warning her to end the call, to maintain boundaries that existed for good reason. Victims didn't owe their victimizers conversations. They didn't owe them understanding or the opportunity for redemption. But her finger stayed frozen, not hanging up, not speaking, just listening to Derek Hutchins breathe on the other end of the line like a man drowning who'd just surfaced for air. "I'm listening," she said finally, and hated how those two words felt like forgiveness when they were only curiosity wearing its disguise. "Not on the phone. In person. There's a diner on Market Street, 24 hours public. I'll be there at 10 tonight. Alone. No badge, no uniform, just..." His voice cracked slightly. "Just a man who needs you to hear something before you tell the world your version of who I am." The audacity of it should have made her angry. Your version, as if what happened was subject to interpretation, as if the knee on her back and the scrape on her cheek were matters of perspective. But something in his tone stopped the anger before it could fully form. This wasn't a man trying to intimidate or manipulate. This was someone who sounded genuinely desperate, backed into a corner where his only option was a truth he'd been avoiding. "I'll think about it," Sarah said, and ended the call before he could respond, before she could change her mind or make promises she shouldn't keep. Marcus's reaction was immediate and predictable when she told him. Absolutely not. Under no circumstances would his daughter meet with the man who'd assaulted her in some late-night diner, regardless of how public it was. Daniel agreed, citing a dozen legal and practical reasons why such a meeting was dangerous, potentially compromising, possibly a setup designed to record her saying something that could be used against her in the court of public opinion. They were right, Sarah knew. Every rational calculation said this was a bad idea, but rationality felt insufficient to the moment. In 3 years, she'd be in college, making decisions without her father's protection, navigating a world that wouldn't always offer the luxury of safe choices. And something about Hutchins's voice, the raw desperation in it, the sense of a man standing at the edge of consequences he couldn't escape, made her wonder if maybe understanding required risk, if maybe the full truth was messier than the story she'd been preparing to tell. "I'm going," she said, watching her father's expression shift through concern and frustration and finally resignation. "But not alone. Daniel can sit at a different table, close enough to intervene if needed. We record everything, and if at any point I feel unsafe, I walk out, but I need to hear what he has to say." "Why?" Marcus asked, and the question held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. What could he possibly say that changes anything? Sarah thought about that, trying to articulate something she barely understood herself. "Because the story I'm planning to tell tomorrow is about a system, about patterns and enabling and the machinery of injustice. And all of that's true. But Hutchins is still a person, not just a symbol. And I think maybe I need to see him as a person before I turn him into an example. Even if, especially if, what he tells me doesn't change my mind about anything." The diner was exactly what she'd expected. Yellow lighting, vinyl booths, the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long, and burgers in various stages of doneness. A few late-night stragglers occupied scattered tables, people who worked odd shifts or couldn't sleep or had nowhere else to be. Hutchins sat in a corner booth, wearing civilian clothes that made him look smaller than the uniform had, more ordinary, just another middle-aged white man dealing with whatever weight he carried. When he saw Sarah enter, followed at a distance by Daniel, something like relief flickered across his face before being replaced by the careful blankness of someone trying to control his own narrative. Sarah slid into the booth across from him, maintaining distance, her phone recording in her pocket as agreed. For a moment neither spoke, just studied each other across the scarred formica, two people connected by violence trying to figure out if conversation was even possible. "Thank you for coming," Hutchins said finally. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure why I did." Sarah kept her voice level, neither warm nor cold, just factual. "You have 20 minutes. Say whatever you came to say." Hutchins nodded, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. He started to speak, stopped, tried again. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking under pressure it had never been designed to hold. He told her about his son. 25 years old, found dead 3 years ago in an alley 6 blocks from where they sat, a victim of gang violence that was never solved, that became another statistic in a city with too many similar statistics. He told her about the rage that had followed, the way grief had curdled into anger that needed a target, a way to make sense of senselessness. He told her about requesting reassignment to neighborhoods with high crime rates, telling himself he was honoring his son's memory by getting dangerous people off the streets, when really he'd been looking for someone to punish for a death that had no satisfying villain. And slowly, he said, his vision had narrowed. Black and brown faces had started to look like threats. Hoodies became uniforms of criminality. The gap between protecting and profiling had closed until he couldn't tell the difference anymore. "I know what you're thinking," he said, and Sarah realized she'd been sitting completely still, barely breathing. "That none of that excuses anything. That my grief doesn't give me the right to hurt other people. You're right. It doesn't. But you asked me for truth, and the truth is I stopped seeing individuals. I saw categories, threats, people who deserved suspicion because they looked like the categories I'd created in my head." He finally looked directly at her, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected, genuine remorse living alongside the desperate need for absolution. "When I saw you that day, I didn't see Sarah Chen, 17 years old, someone's daughter, a person with a whole life and story. I saw a template, a pattern my brain had learned to recognize as danger. And by the time I realized I was wrong, my hands were already on you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and complicated. Sarah felt competing emotions war inside her, fury that his trauma had been transmuted into her trauma, that his inability to process grief had resulted in her face pressed against concrete. But also something else, something harder to name. Recognition, maybe, that pain created pain, that hurt people often hurt other people in cycles that perpetuated themselves across generations until someone found the courage to break them. "Your son," she said quietly. "Tell me about him. Not about his death. About his life." The request clearly surprised Hutchins. His eyes went distant, traveling back to memories that probably hurt to visit. "Marcus." His name was Marcus. The coincidence landed hard. The same name as her father, connecting them in ways that felt almost too symbolic to be real. Hutchins talked about his son for 10 minutes, and the man who emerged was young and funny and complicated, someone who'd struggled with direction but had finally found purpose working with at-risk youth, trying to break cycles of violence in his own community. Someone who'd seen more in people than their worst moments, who'd believed in second chances and the possibility of change. Someone who would have been horrified, Hutchins admitted, to know what his father had become in the wake of his death. "He used to tell me I saw the world too simply," Hutchins said. "Good guys and bad guys, like life was a movie where you could tell the heroes by their costumes. He tried to get me to understand that people were complicated, that the same person could make terrible choices and still be worth saving." A bitter laugh. "Guess he was trying to prepare me for this conversation." Sarah absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the officer who'd put his hands on her, trying to hold both truths simultaneously. That trauma explained but didn't excuse. That understanding motivation didn't erase harm. The world insisted on binary thinking, wanted her to categorize Hutchins as purely victim or purely villain, but reality refused such clean divisions. "What you did to me," she said carefully, "and to DeMarco, and Alicia, and Keisha, and probably others we don't even know about, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern, a choice you made repeatedly. Your grief doesn't undo that damage." "I know. And tomorrow I'm still going to tell our stories. I'm still going to talk about how the system enabled you, how the complaints were dismissed, how the structure protects officers even when the evidence shows they're causing harm." "I know. So why tell me this? What do you want from me? What do—" Hutchins was quiet for a long time, staring into his cold coffee like it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to know that I see you now. Sarah Chen, 17 years old, someone who likes—" He paused, clearly searching memory. "Korean dramas, according to the social media my lawyer pulled up. Someone who got a perfect score on her AP chemistry exam. Someone whose father loves her enough to make the chief of police answer his phone at 3 in the afternoon and explain why his officer had hands on his daughter." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I want you to know that I failed in the most fundamental duty of my job, to protect and serve everyone, not just the people my broken brain decided were safe. And I want—" His voice cracked. "I want you to know I'm sorry. Not because sorry fixes anything, not because I expect forgiveness, just because you deserve to hear someone say it and mean it." The apology should have felt good, vindicating, proof that she'd been right to demand accountability. But instead it just felt heavy, like accepting responsibility for someone else's conscience, like being asked to absolve sins she had no authority to forgive. Sarah thought about her father's warning, about how this meeting could complicate the narrative she was planning to present, could humanize a man who was easier to fight as a symbol than as a person. But humans were always more complicated than symbols, and maybe that complication was the point. "I can't forgive you," she said finally. "That's not mine to give. You'd need to hear that from every person you've harmed, and some of them might never be ready to say it. But I hear you. I hear that you're sorry, and I hear that your son would be disappointed in what you became." Hutchins flinched like she'd struck him, but nodded. "He would be. He is. I feel it every day." Sarah stood, the 20 minutes long since past, her mind churning with implications and emotions she'd need time to process. Daniel was already moving toward them, protective instinct engaged. But before she left, Sarah had one more question. "What happens to you now, after tomorrow, after the press conference, after all of this becomes public?" "I'll probably lose my job, definitely lose my reputation. Maybe face charges, depending on how aggressive the district attorney wants to be." Hutchins shrugged, the gesture carrying exhausted acceptance. "But honestly, I think I lost myself 3 years ago in that alley with my son. Everything since has just been the slow realization of that loss." He met her eyes one last time. "What you're doing tomorrow, telling these stories, forcing people to see the pattern, do it. Don't hold back, because you met me here, because you heard my reasons. The system needs to break, even if I break with it, especially if I break with it. Maybe that's how I honor Marcus, the real one, the one who believed people could change." Sarah left without responding, stepping out into the San Francisco night where fog was rolling in from the bay, softening the city's edges, making everything feel liminal and uncertain. Daniel caught up with her on the sidewalk, questions already forming, but she waved them off. She needed silence, needed space to hold all the contradictory truths she'd just absorbed. That Hutchins was both perpetrator and victim. That understanding his pain didn't excuse his actions. that her anger remained righteous, even as she recognized his humanity. The recording in her pocket held the entire conversation, evidence that could be used in multiple ways. She could release it, show the world that even the officer who'd harmed her carried his own trauma. She could bury it, keep the narrative clean and simple for tomorrow's press conference. The choice was hers, and the weight of it felt enormous. At home, she found her father still awake, waiting in the living room with tea that had gone cold, looking older than she'd ever seen him. He didn't ask what happened, just opened his arms, and Sarah folded into them the way she had as a child, when he could still fix everything broken just by being dad. But she wasn't a child anymore, and some things couldn't be fixed, only navigated with grace and courage, and the willingness to sit with complexity rather than demanding simplicity. "I met a person tonight," she said into his shoulder. "Not a monster, not a hero. Just a person who made terrible choices because he was drowning in his own pain. And tomorrow I'm still going to hold him accountable. But now I know what that accountability costs. Does that make me weak?" Marcus pulled back to look at her face, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "It makes you human, and human is always harder than righteous." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The strongest thing you can do is see someone fully, their pain, their failures, their humanity, and still demand they face consequences for the harm they caused. Accountability without empathy is just revenge. But empathy without accountability is enabling. You're trying to hold both. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." Sarah thought about DeMarco and Alicia and Keisha, about the stories they were preparing to tell, about the press conference waiting like a storm on tomorrow's horizon. She thought about Officer Hutchins sitting in that diner, carrying his dead son's name and his living guilt. She thought about the system that had enabled all of it. The machinery that processed pain into policy, into more pain in endless cycles. And she thought about her own power, purchased by privilege, magnified by platform, and the responsibility that came with being able to speak when so many others had been silenced. The recording stayed in her pocket, unshared, a private truth she'd carry forward into whatever came next. Some things needed to be witnessed rather than broadcast, held rather than weaponized. Tomorrow she would stand on those steps and tell the story that needed telling, the one about patterns and accountability and the cost of looking away. But tonight, she sat with her father in the quiet dark and let herself feel everything. The anger and the fear and the unexpected grief for a young man named Marcus, who died 3 years ago and created ripples that had reached her sidewalk. Her face, her understanding of how pain moved through the world, finding new victims until someone had the courage to say enough. Monday morning arrived with typical California indifference, sun bright and sky clear, the world refusing to acknowledge the significance of what was about to happen. Sarah dressed carefully. Nothing too expensive or flashy. Nothing that would let critics dismiss her as a privileged girl playing at activism, but nothing downtrodden either. She chose dignity, chose strength, chose to look like exactly what she was, someone who'd been harmed and refused to stay silent. The steps of City Hall had been transformed into a stage, and Sarah understood in that moment how carefully power was performed, how much of justice was theater designed to move the audience toward belief. News cameras formed a semicircle, their lenses like hungry eyes. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended like offerings. Behind her stood DeMarco, Alicia, and Keisha, 3 people who'd agreed to make themselves vulnerable because staying invisible had cost them too much already. And somewhere in the crowd, she knew, people were watching who would use this moment for their own purposes. Activists and politicians and opportunists who saw stories as currency to be spent. Daniel stood to her left, ready to step in if needed. Her father stood further back, deliberately removed from the frame, understanding that this moment belonged to his daughter and the people she'd chosen to stand with. His presence was support, not rescue. She'd insisted on that. Sarah stepped to the microphone, feeling the weight of attention like physical pressure. For a moment her mind went blank, all her prepared remarks evaporating in the face of the actual moment. Then she remembered Hutchins in that diner, his confession about stopping seeing individuals and starting seeing categories. She remembered DeMarco's exhausted certainty that speaking up would change nothing. She remembered her own face pressed against concrete and the surprise of discovering that privilege was conditional, that safety was negotiable, that the world her parents had built around her had gaps large enough to fall through. She began to speak. The words came not from the script Daniel had prepared, but from somewhere deeper, from the place where anger and understanding had been forced to coexist. She told her story first, simply and without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. A 17-year-old girl, a bracelet, a sidewalk, a knee between shoulder blades. The fear that came with realizing how quickly the world could turn hostile. Then she stepped aside and let DeMarco tell his story, then Alicia, then Keisha. Each account different in details, but identical in structure. People existing in public space, questioned for no reason beyond the color of their skin, their bodies treated as evidence of crimes uncommitted. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemicals, invisible details becoming visible, undeniable. This wasn't about one officer's bad judgment. This was about a system that gave some people authority over other people's bodies, over their time, over their dignity, and then protected that authority even when it was abused. The complaints had been filed, the evidence had been presented, and nothing had changed because nothing was designed to change, because the machine was operating exactly as intended, sorting people into categories of protected and suspicious based on criteria that were never spoken but always understood. But Sarah also did something unexpected. She talked about Officer Hutchins's son. Not to excuse his actions, she was careful about that, but to complicate the narrative, to push back against the comfortable story where victims were pure and perpetrators were monsters. She talked about how pain moved through communities, how trauma could be weaponized, how grief could curdle into anger that found the wrong targets. She talked about the responsibility of systems to heal people, rather than deploy them broken and dangerous into communities that would bear the cost of their unprocessed wounds. The reporters shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the clean story they'd expected, the simple tale of villains getting their deserved punishment. This was messier, more complicated, harder to reduce to a headline. But Sarah could see others in the crowd nodding, recognizing something true in the complexity. Understanding that real change required seeing all the layers, not just the comfortable ones. She ended by announcing a foundation, funded by her father, dedicated to supporting people who filed complaints against law enforcement, providing legal resources and protection and visibility to those who usually faced retaliation for speaking truth. It wasn't enough. She said that clearly. No foundation could fix systemic racism, could undo centuries of patterns embedded in institutions and unconscious minds. But it was something. A crack in the foundation. A place to apply pressure. A signal that silence was no longer the only option for people without power. The questions came fast and hostile from some quarters, supportive from others, each reporter bringing their own agenda to the moment. Sarah answered what she could, deflected what she needed to, and kept returning to the central point. Patterns mattered more than individuals. Systems created outcomes, and accountability required looking at structures rather than just punishing symptoms. When she was asked if she hated Officer Hutchins, she paused for a long time before answering. I hate what he did. I hate the system that enabled him. But hate isn't useful. What's useful is understanding how this happens, how good people, or people who think they're good, can cause so much harm, and then changing the conditions that make that harm possible. The press conference ended not with dramatic confrontation but with gradual dispersal. People drifting away to file stories and form opinions and turn this moment into content that would fill the next news cycle before being replaced by whatever came next. Sarah felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, wrung out but somehow more solid, like she'd been tested in fire and discovered she was stronger than she'd known. In the days that followed, the story metastasized across media platforms, fracturing into 1,000 different versions depending on who was telling it. Conservative outlets focused on Sarah's wealth, arguing that privileged activists with billionaire fathers had no standing to criticize police. Progressive outlets celebrated her courage while downplaying the complexity she'd introduced by humanizing Hutchins. Social media performed its usual function, amplifying extremes and erasing nuance. Death threats arrived. Not many, but enough to require enhanced security. So did messages of support from people she'd never met, other families with similar stories, other communities bearing similar scars. Officer Derek Hutchins resigned before he could be fired, a strategic move that protected his pension but ended his career. The department announced reforms, better training on implicit bias, stricter oversight of complaints, community liaisons to improve relations. All the usual promises that sounded good in press releases, but meant nothing without structural change. Sarah knew better than to celebrate those announcements. Real change moved slowly, measured in generations rather than news cycles, built through persistent pressure rather than single moments of revelation. But something else happened that mattered more. The foundation began receiving applications from people across the country who'd filed complaints and been ignored, who'd experienced retaliation and had no resources to fight back, who'd stayed silent because silence seemed safer than speaking. Each application was a story, another data point in the pattern, another piece of evidence that what had happened to Sarah and DeMarco and Alicia and Keisha was not exceptional, but routine. The invisibility was the point. The silence was the strategy. And once the silence broke, once the pattern became visible, the ground shifted in ways that were harder to reverse. DeMarco got a promotion at work, his supervisor impressed by his willingness to speak publicly despite the risk. Alicia enrolled in community college, pursuing a degree in social work, wanting to help other people navigate systems that weren't designed for their survival. Keisha started a blog documenting her experiences, giving voice to realities that news media rarely covered because they were too ordinary, too everyday to count as news. Small victories, personal rather than systemic, but victories nonetheless. Sarah returned to school and discovered she'd become something she'd never wanted to be, famous for being victimized. The attention was uncomfortable, the scrutiny exhausting. People wanted her to be a symbol, to represent something larger than herself, to carry meanings she'd never agreed to bear. She tried to resist that flattening, to maintain her personhood against the pressure to become icon or example. Some days, she succeeded. Other days, the weight of representation felt crushing, and she understood why so many activists burned out. Why justice work demanded more than any single person should have to give. But she also discovered something unexpected. Teachers started incorporating discussions of implicit bias and systemic racism into curriculum. Students formed groups to document police encounters, creating community oversight through collective witnessing. Small changes, local rather than national, but changes that suggested the story had resonated deeper than headlines, had planted seeds that would grow in ways she couldn't predict or control. That was the thing about telling truth publicly. You couldn't direct its impact, couldn't determine who it reached or how it changed them. You could only speak and hope the words found the people who needed them. 6 months after the press conference, Sarah received a letter forwarded through the foundation. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting from the signature on the complaint form she'd reviewed. Officer Derek Hutchins had written to tell her he was volunteering with an organization that worked with families affected by violence, trying to help people process trauma without letting it poison them the way his own grief had poisoned him. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or recognition, just informing her that her words had reached him, that choosing to see his humanity while holding him accountable had cracked something open in him that needed breaking. He ended with a quote his son had loved from a poet Sarah didn't recognize. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Sarah filed the letter away without responding. Some communications deserved acknowledgement, but not engagement. Hutchins's healing was his own work to do, not her responsibility to facilitate or approve. She told him the truth on those steps, that forgiveness wasn't hers to give, that accountability and empathy could coexist, but didn't cancel each other out. Whatever transformation he was attempting was between him and his conscience and the memory of a son who'd believed in second chances. On the anniversary of that day, 1 year since a shopping trip became a flashpoint, since routine became trauma, Sarah found herself back in that jewelry store, unplanned, just passing by and deciding to enter. The manager recognized her immediately, started to apologize again for not intervening, for not protecting her better. Sarah waved the apology away. What happened wasn't the store's fault. The problem lived in structures larger than any individual business. She looked at bracelets, not buying, just looking. The one she'd purchased that day sat in her jewelry box at home, unworn. She couldn't quite bring herself to wear it, but couldn't quite bring herself to get rid of it either. It existed in limbo, neither treasured nor discarded, an artifact of a moment that had changed her but didn't define her. Her father met her outside. Having tracked her location through the family app, they still maintained despite her increasing independence. They walked together without particular destination, father and daughter, through streets that were both familiar and strange. San Francisco continued its work of being a city, people rushing, vendors selling, the machinery of urban life grinding forward with or without their participation. Marcus didn't ask what she was thinking, didn't offer wisdom or comfort. Just walked beside her, present, the way he'd been present through everything. "Do you think it mattered?" Sarah asked finally. "The press conference, the foundation, all of it. Did we actually change anything?" Marcus considered the question with his usual care. "Some things changed, not enough things, not the fundamental things. The machine is still running, still sorting people into categories, still protecting its own. But there are cracks now that weren't there before. Light getting in, and cracks widen, given pressure and time. That's not very satisfying. No, but it's true. And truth is better than comfort when you're trying to figure out where to apply your energy." He paused at a corner, waiting for the light to change. "You asked me once what power I had, how much I could change with a phone call. Here's what I've learned building companies and making money and accumulating what people call influence. Power changes some things immediately and other things not at all. You can move individuals, but moving systems requires more than any one person possesses. It requires communities, coalitions, sustained pressure over time. It requires accepting that you'll do the work and maybe never see the full results. That the world you're building might only become visible to your children or their children." Sarah absorbed this, testing it against her own exhausted hope. She wanted revolution, wanted transformation, wanted the world to look fundamentally different because she'd had the courage to speak. But the world changed slowly when it changed at all. Resistant to individuals, shaped by forces larger and older than any single voice. Maybe that was okay. Maybe fighting for incremental progress was its own form of courage, requiring faith that small victories accumulated into larger ones, that cracks widened, that light entered wounds and made them places where healing could eventually occur. They reached the car, and Sarah hesitated before getting in, looking back at the jewelry store, the sidewalk, the ordinary geography that had become part of her story. She thought about who she'd been a year ago, younger, more naive, protected by assumptions about how the world worked that had been violently disproven. She couldn't go back to that innocence, couldn't unknow what she'd learned about how easily safety dissolved, how conditional belonging was for bodies marked as other. But she also couldn't live forever in that moment of violation, couldn't let one terrible afternoon define the architecture of her entire life. The question wasn't whether that day had changed her. It had. The question was what she would build with the person she'd become. Wiser, angrier, more aware of both her power and its limits, carrying stories that weren't hers alone, but belonged to everyone who'd experienced similar violations and found their voices stolen by systems designed to silence. She got in the car. Her father started the engine. And as they pulled away from the curb, Sarah wondered about all the other stories that would never be told. All the other encounters that would happen tomorrow and next week and next year in cities across the country. Moments of casual injustice witnessed only by cameras, or not witnessed at all. Absorbed into the bodies and memories of people who'd learned that speaking changed nothing. So staying silent was safer. Those stories deserved telling too. Those people deserved the protection her privilege had provided. The foundation would continue that work. Others would take up the cause. The movement was larger than any individual, would outlast any single voice. That was both the frustration and the hope. That no one person could fix everything, but together, applying pressure to cracks, making silence untenable, refusing to accept patterns as inevitable. Maybe transformation became possible. Sarah pulled out her phone and began typing a message to the group chat with DeMarco and Alicia and Keisha. Just checking in, seeing how they were doing, maintaining the connection that had been forged in shared experience and sustained through mutual commitment to keep telling truth when truth was inconvenient. They responded quickly, with updates about their lives, with small victories and persistent frustrations, with the everyday work of surviving in a world that required constant vigilance from bodies it marked as suspect. And in those messages, Sarah found something like peace. Not the peace of problem solved or justice finally delivered. The peace of not being alone, of knowing that the work continued, that the cracks widened, that light entered wounds and changed them into something that could bear witness, could teach, could heal. The city passed outside the window, beautiful and broken, full of people carrying their own stories, their own wounds, their own small acts of resistance against systems that sought to diminish them. And somewhere in that city, someone else was having an encounter with power that would change them, force them to choose between silence and speaking, between accepting injustice and demanding something better. Sarah hoped they found the courage to speak, hoped they had people who would stand with them when they did, hoped the cracks would continue widening until the whole structure finally had to change or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. That hope didn't erase the fear or anger or the memory of concrete against her cheek, but it coexisted with those things, making space for complexity, for the recognition that change came slowly and painfully and never as completely as required. Hope was choosing to fight anyway, to apply pressure to cracks, to refuse the comfort of silence even when speaking cost more than seemed fair. The car turned toward home, toward ordinary life continuing despite extraordinary moments, toward the future Sarah was building one choice at a time. And in that future she carried all of it, the trauma and the triumph, the fear and the courage, the privilege that had saved her, and the responsibility that came with being saved. She carried the stories of people who'd trusted her with their truth, and the weight of everyone still silent, still waiting for the world to be safe enough for speaking. She carried the question that had started this entire journey, the one about what happens when power meets prejudice and everything shatters. And she carried the answer she'd learned through living it. What happens depends on who has power, who exercises courage, who chooses to see humanity in complexity rather than comfort in simplicity. What happens depends on whether cracks widen or get sealed, whether light enters or darkness persists, whether enough people decide that the world as it is cannot be the world as it remains. The answer was still being written, in her life and thousands of others, in moments large and small, in choices made and voices raised and silences finally, courageously, broken.